Hello and welcome everyone to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the introduction to the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to examine the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to talk about the introductory material. This would include things and comments like the structure of the Gospel, authorship, dating, how it's divided up, major themes that we'll see in the Gospel. In other words, it's things that are helpful to know as we approach and read it to be able to understand what the author's true intention is in the writing. And so let's go ahead and talk about structure. So the Gospel of Mark is not linear. Things may come out of order. They're more structured thematically. Additionally, the time of the Gospel of Mark, there are times when a lot of time passes in a few passages, and there are passages where time seems to slow down in terms of they're moving very slowly through time. This especially happens as we get closer to the end of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark will often use repetition for emphasis, and it has rhetorical markers that help make the connections between the sections clear. But it's important that we don't impose too much structure or symmetry on it. Also, we have to understand that the writers were not concerned with writing a chronological sequence, or Mark was not in this case. That's pretty important because otherwise you can start to make judgments against the book without really taking into account what the author was doing. Now, in the first 8 chapters, we see that there's very much an action-oriented narrative being presented, and it's focusing on the powerful ministry of Jesus through miracles and his teachings. And following the confession of Jesus as Christ on the road to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus begins to then teach about his coming suffering and death. And so we're seeing this as a transitional point toward the cross. And it's interesting because the emphasis is disproportionate on the final events of Jesus' life. You're going to see a lot of Mark, especially after 11, taking place about the final events of Jesus' life. There's a lot of emphasis on that, which makes sense. And in response to the opposition that Jesus will see, we're going to see that he withdraws from the hostility, and he calls and commissions his disciples into further service in a new location, in a new way. Now, part 2 of the gospel, we're going to see the events are more chronological. So once we move into the passion narrative, it does become a lot more chronological. And the key points are going to shift over are going to be after the triumphal entry and then the final Passover. And so from a narrative perspective, after chapter 11, verse 1, time is going to slow down in terms of we're going to spend a lot more time on a very small portion of time. Now, in terms of the divisions, we see that Mark is going to begin with the beginning of the gospel, an introduction. He moves very quickly into the ministry of Christ. He's going to talk about the authority of Jesus and the blindness of the Pharisees. There's going to be healing miracles and controversial stories. Then he'll move on to the parables and signs of Jesus and the blindness of the world. You'll see discipleship and opposition rise up here. There'll be more parables and dramatic miracles. And then you'll see Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles and the blindness of the disciples. So it's interesting. You get blindness of Pharisees, blindness of the world, blindness of disciples. You'll see more mission of Christ going forward, more opposition and more miracles. Very common for these to intensify. You'll see this issue of clean and unclean and withdrawal from Israel. You'll see the physical and spiritual eyesight being compared as well. And after that, Mark moves into the passion of the Christ. You see the predictions of death and the meaning of discipleship. You see the cross and the resurrection foreshadowed. You see true servanthood being mentioned. You see his ministry in Judea in light of the cross. You see Jesus in the temple, his entry and then judgment. You see the teachings and debates, the prediction of the destruction of the temple and Christ's return. And then finally, the climax of Jesus' life, the preparation for the suffering, the crucifixion, and then the resurrection. And that essentially gives us a pretty decent rundown on what's contained in the Gospel of Mark. So again, to summarize, you see a beginning, you see the ministry of Christ, his authority, and you see the blindness of the Pharisees' world and disciples. You see the miracles and the teachings and the parables. And then it shifts into the Passion of the Christ, where we see the resurrection and crucifixion fully on display. Theologically, we see that Mark juxtaposes Christ's mighty deeds with his suffering and death. Again, the first half, you're getting all of the mighty deeds of Jesus. In the second half, you're getting his suffering and death. And Mark, to some extent, is trying to balance 2 essential truths. That Jesus is the King, eternal, in glory, and he's also trying to balance the centrality of the cross to Jesus' work on this earth. And so you see this both in the life of Jesus and the life of the disciples. And this gospel, above all the others, best balances the emphasis on divinity with his humanity. You really do get both here. It also balances his authority and servanthood. And Mark's main point, we could argue for the entire gospel, is that Jesus has defeated death and sin by the means of the crucifixion or that Jesus' defeat of death and sin by means of the crucifixion of God's Son. Now, in terms of Christological titles, we see the Son of God, or God's Son, highlights Jesus' exalted role. It's showing his sentness from God. In fact, if we take a look at Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. We see that clearly Jesus was sent by God. His origin is of God. We see this again reiterated with the Roman centurion in Jesus' death, and also in the heavenly voice speaking from heaven during the baptism. Other than those three, those are the only three really times we see God's Son mentioned. We see it on the lips of demons. We see that Jesus was sent by God. He acts for God. He speaks on behalf of God and is vindicated by God. Christ or the Messiah is not too common either. But there is this motif or this theme of the messianic secret. Frequently, Jesus is going to command people to not tell anyone about his identity. And the insight, similarly, the secret, the insight about parables is reserved to insiders. Demonic confessions are rebuked, and the spectacular miracles are reported to be told to no one. And what's the reason for hiding this? Well, Jesus understood that the popular notion of what a Messiah would be was not going to include the suffering servant. That was not going to be part of what people were expecting. They were going to be wanting him to come in victory and conquer Rome and free Israel. And the issue is Jesus knew that these things, without that context, are going to generate opposition. Such strong opposition that it would lead to a premature death. And so, in some sense, he is really demonstrating God's sovereignty to see the crucifixion done at the exact right time. Now, what are some other distinctive themes? Well, we see disciples and discipleship as being a major theme. Mark is going to show how the disciples fail, how they misunderstand things, how they don't grasp Jesus' parables, how their hearts are hardened, how they have little faith, how they're perplexed after crucial miracles, how they're unable to fill Christ's commission to exorcise demons at times. Peter is rebuked immediately after a confession of Jesus as Messiah. And the disciples' spiritual blindness is going to be contrasted with two miracle stories about how the blind literally will receive sight. Peter again denies Jesus, Judas betrays him, all the disciples flee. But interestingly enough, they remain faithful to his initial call. They're given truths that outsiders aren't, and they receive special privileges and promises about the future. And so we can see, what is a disciple? Well, at this time during the Gospels, the disciples weren't saved, not at least in the understanding we get it now. They weren't born again. They didn't have the new nature yet. And so when they did, it made a huge difference. This is one of the reasons why we see them in the Gospels in the light that we do. Concerning women, they seem to fare better, but at the resurrection, they're trembling, bewildered, they flee from the tomb and initially say nothing because of their fear. Mark shows essentially that all people are unable to respond to God in that present age, apart from God's acting on their behalf. In other words, if you're not born again, you won't get it. Often we look and we say, well, we would understand it, we would see it, and often it's Christians who are saying that, and the reality is no. We understand and we see it because we are saved. But they weren't, nor are the non-Christians now. And so it is foolishness to them. They do not understand it, they do not perceive it. What about Mark's eschatology? Well, it preserved a lively hope of Christ's return in the very near future. Now, the later Gospels are going to reflect a sense of delay, but Mark's Gospel, still very imminent. The eschatological discourse is the one sermon preserved in Mark 13, and it has a cosmic apocalyptic eschatology. So this is a world-ending, world-changing kind of eschatology. It also holds the message of about Jesus as good news. The gospel is used as a term for a story about Jesus rather than for the message Jesus himself brought. Okay? For example, Romans 1:1-4. Take a look at that. Be an antecedent. Paul, a servant of Christ, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. This would be assuming to relate to, the gospel message about Jesus. Okay, the gospels. Okay. Again, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scripture regarding his son, who, as to his earthly life, was a descendant of David, and through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God, empowered by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Okay. Now, There's actually a lot of interesting things in that verse. I do an entire thing on that verse, especially 3 through 4, about how that's a creed, actually. Now, you also have in Mark Isaiah's New Exodus. So Mark doesn't begin with a birth narrative. It jumps actually straight to John the Baptist. And there's this prophetic reuse of the Exodus motif of entering the promised land from the desert. It's being applied to the time after Israel's exile into Assyrian Babylon. But here it's being applied to Jesus, essentially after persecution. And there are a lot of parallels between Isaiah's Exodus motif and the Gospel of Mark. And you'll see this throughout the book of Mark. Now, what were the circumstances in which it was written? Well, most people associate Mark's Gospel with Rome or regions of Italy. Interestingly enough, Chrysostom later associates it with Egypt. And Eusebius and Epiphanius, they state that Mark went to Egypt after writing the Gospel in Rome. And people would argue that Roman origin is better attested and fits well with the internal evidence. For example, there's a negative portrait of the disciples prior to the church, and the way of the cross is a precursor to glory. And this could be a concern to reassure a struggling community that it too could eventually cope and victory would come only through suffering. For example, there's a lot of persecution in Rome between 49 and 60 AD. Additionally, there's the use of various Latinisms, quadrans for the penny in 1242 and the praetorium for the palace in 1516. There's a frequent explanation of Jewish concepts and terms like ritual hand washing and korban in 7, 3 through 4, and 11. There's a combination of mostly lower class and a few upper class concerns. Makes sense for Rome. There's a mixed ethnicity of people with whom Jesus interacts. There's repeated dealings of people in houses. But we really can't put too much weight on this because, again, these things can be used to be harmonized with other things, and this is really just the reality of the story. So we can't just say, oh, it's all pertaining to the situation or the culture of Rome or something. But, these are some little details that I think could be worth looking at. The external evidence is divided, however. And so I'd like to go ahead and read Clement, and this is from Eusebius. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and read Clement as recorded in Eusebius. All right. All right. This is Clement. When Peter had preached the word publicly in Rome and announced the gospel by the Spirit, those present, of whom there were many, besought Mark, since for a long time he had followed him and remembered what had been said, to record his words. Mark did this and communicated the gospel to those who made request of him. When Peter knew of it, he neither actively prevented nor encouraged the undertaking. Okay, kind of interesting. We also have Irenaeus, who argued that Peter had already died when Mark wrote, so this is after Peter and Paul's departure, that it was a transmission, not a composition. Peter was martyred under Nero before 68 AD, and thus the question would be, well, did Mark compose his gospel at some earlier date, like 64 to 65? There's also interesting concepts about the prediction of the temple, which secular scholars would argues for a post-70 dating, but that's a secular understanding. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it's a very muted reference to the destruction of the temple, and second, it's anti-supernaturalism. It's simply unwarranted anti-supernaturalism. It denies Jesus the powers of predictive prophecy. So that isn't an argument that's going to fly in any truly supernatural believing circle. Many people date Mark to the mid to late 60s, but internal evidence with Luke states that it's possibly earlier. You even have J. Warner Wallace arguing for a 45 to 50 year date, which I think is very feasible. It's very feasible. And the way he does this is he basically says, well, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and no one's going to write about this. The siege of Jerusalem happens in 67. No one's writing about that. The deaths of James, Peter, and Paul happened between 61 and 65. No one records those. Luke then writes Acts, recording none of those other details. He ends before that. So people say, well, maybe 57 to 60 AD. Paul's going to quote Luke. 53 to 57 then for Paul. Luke is going to write his gospel then before that in 50 to 53 AD. And then Mark is going to quote some of Luke, so he would write his gospel sometime between 45 and 50. So it's interesting, and that, by the way, is only 12 to 17 years after the life of Jesus. So, I mean, you're talking about very, very early in terms of when this was written, comparatively. In terms of authorship, all traditions from antiquity support John Mark as the author, the companion of Peter and Paul. And we can see his companionship in Acts 12:12 and 25, 13:5 and 13, 15:37, Colossians 4:10, 2 Timothy 4:11, Philemon 24, and 1 Peter 5:13. Now, we know that Mark had a falling out with Paul, but Paul's greeting in the epistles demonstrates that they were probably reconciled, and Mark was the person whose mother's home was one of the meeting places for the early church in Jerusalem, Acts 12:12. Now, who attests to Mark as the author? Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Jerome, and the Muratorian canon. Pretty much everything we would want in early church history. And it's consistently associate this information with Peter's preaching. So there's a very historical reason why we hold Mark as the author, and it's Peter's testimony. The oldest and most important of these attestations is actually from Papias, again quoted in Eusebius. I'll go ahead and read that now. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order, of the things said or done by the Lord, for he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him, but later on, as I said, followed Peter, who used to give teaching as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard and to make no false statements in them. So we get this idea that it was out of order, that Mark was writing what Peter was saying, his interpreter. Okay? So that's kind of cool. All right. This affirms, again, a non-chronological order, and it also states that he was highly selective in what was chosen to include without falsifying the material that was included. So there was an attention paid to the text itself. So what are the arguments against Markian authorship? The author wasn't Jewish. So this would be the lack of Jewish coloring, Latinisms, confused topography of Mark 7:31. The issue here, though, is this just demonstrates a Gentile audience. You know, this doesn't necessarily come back on Mark. Secondly, Mark 7:31, he's talking about going from one city to another and then to another. And the comment is, as well, though that's not the way you would go if you were going to those cities. The issue is that, well, if Jesus were doing itinerant, circuitous preaching schedule, that'd be fine. So there's no real issue there. Some argue that the gospel shows no contact with Pauline theology, yet the cross is central to Paul and it's central to Mark. So that doesn't really jive. It's disparaging in the way it treats Peter. So some people say, well, it couldn't be from Peter. Arguably, the problem with that is no one but Peter could have authorized so negative a treatment, combating potentially an inflated view of himself. And finally, material must have come from multiple sources. Well, that dependence on Peter doesn't mean or doesn't preclude other sources. So yeah, Mark probably got some other sources. That's fine. But again, anyone unfamiliar with the true author but desiring to credit it to an authoritative witness would not have chosen Mark as the author. Again, choose one of the disciples if you're going to attribute this falsely, not somebody who wasn't one of the 12. So it does seem like this is Mark. I would argue it is Mark, and even historical evidence, I think, actually lies pretty heavily with that, both internal evidence as well as external attestation from other sources. And so that's basic rundown of the Gospel of Mark. Nice short talk tonight. Not too complicated, but again, we just wanted to go through authorship, dating, things of that nature, some of those general concerns, and the basic themes, the basic breakdown of what Mark is and how it proceeds. Again, it's very action-oriented, very immediately. A lot of immediately is used in the Gospel of Mark, and gives a very heavy section of the Gospel to the Passion events. So with that, I'll go ahead and paste in a Zoom link if people would like to talk further. We can go ahead and engage over Zoom. So I'll go ahead and put this in now. And with that, I'll go ahead and close. So thank you all for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope you have enjoyed this talk on the introduction to the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark. And with that, have a wonderful evening.